Over the course of its history, many nations throughout the world have been involved in countless conflicts, ranging from small regional skirmishes to mass globe-spanning wars. Sadly though, many of these conflicts have been lost or rarely covered, so for my 1000 subscribers special, I'll be going over some of the forgotten wars from my home country, the Commonwealth of Australia. Also, quick disclaimer before we begin, some of these wars might actually be pretty widely known, but I want to cover them from the POV of Australia, which is something I don't see too often. So, with that out of the way, let's start. Okay, so if you didn't know, Australia and many other Entente nations sent troops to White Russia throughout the Civil War in 1918. Australia leading up to this point has proved itself greatly throughout World War I, as they fought on many fronts and had great experience, and as the war ended, Aussie intervention forces were sent into Russia for mainly non-combat roles, like training and reconnaissance. However, this would change in August of 1919, when Australian forces would be grouped in the North Russian Relief Force, an army of mainly international troops that would be tasked with their first combat operation. Australian and other foreign forces were to take part in an attack across the Dneva River to disrupt and weaken Bolshevik forces there so that the Archangelsk garrison, a nearby city, could be safely withdrawn. Following this success, the RRF would continue their attack now across the Shaika River, which would ultimately end in a victory. Although this wasn't the biggest battle of the Russian Civil War, for Australia it was a great and hard-fought victory that goes overlooked nowadays. The Boer War technically happened during the Federation of Australia, so I was kinda debating on whether to include this conflict. But since Australia's involvement isn't really talked about, I decided to put it in. So, at the outbreak of the war with the Boer states, Britain called up Australian troops to fight, which they did so, as the 7 states offered troops which would be known as contingents. These new forces would start to arrive in South Africa by December of 1899, and the first battle would take place in February of the following year, when the Queensland Mounted Infantry and the New South Wales Lancers took part in the relief of the Siege of Kimberley. Over the next few months, Aussie troops would be attached to South African and British divisions as they captured major South African towns. And by September of 1900, the war had broken down into a guerrilla resistance by the Boers, which would ultimately end in May of 1902. Overall, this conflict was Australia's first proper war as a nation, as by the time it had ended, the Federation of Australia had been complete, and they had proved themselves well in battle. On June 16, 1948, a mass terrorist attack by Malayan communists on 3 Europeans would spark a communist insurgency in the jungles of Malaysia. Britain would soon declare a state of emergency and start sending in forces. Australia's involvement in the conflict wouldn't fully begin until 1950, when the Royal Australian Air Force would arrive into the country. Australia's role in the war would be initially air-focused, as C-47 Dakotas and Avro Lincoln planes of the RAAF would be tasked with cargo runs, troop movements, and paratroop drops. However, by 1952, as the war dragged on, the RAAF would be put in charge of bombing runs and close air support. In October of 1955 though, Australian ground forces would finally arrive into Malaysia in the form of the 2nd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment. This battalion and other future ones that were sent into Malaysia were ultimately tasked with counter-insurgency roles, and officially, the Malayan Emergency would end in 1960, with Australia fully pulling out by August of 1963. The Malayan Emergency was sort of Australia's precursor to the Vietnam War, as already in 1962, Aussie troops were being deployed into South Vietnam. Okay, so for the last entry, I wanted to do a more modern conflict, which is why I chose Operation Astute. So in the years leading up to 2006, East Timor had experienced mass instability and unrest as pro-Indonesian militia groups had escalated their violence on Timorese and pro-independent civilians. In the wake of this, an international intervention force headed by Australia would be formed and sent to the war-torn nation, with the beginning of Operation Astute. These troops would be tasked with peacekeeping and counterinsurgency operations in the most unstable regions of East Timor. and by 2010 most pro-Indonesian militia groups had collapsed. Still though, Australia maintains a military presence in the region to this day. Well, there we have it. Thanks so much for making it to the end of the video, and of course, thanks for 1k subs. Sorry if this video was a bit short, especially for a subscriber special, but I still hope this could be the start of a brand new series on the channel. So comment down below what country I should do next. Like and subscribe, and I will see you guys later.